It starts with a question most people never think to ask. What happens when you become famous before you even understand who you are, and then the world refuses to let you become anything else? Because for Justine Bateman, fame wasn't something she chased. It arrived early, loudly, and permanently. And once it arrived, it didn't just change her life, it began to consume it. In the 1980s, she wasn't just known. She was everywhere. Millions of people didn't just watch her. They grew up with her face, her voice, her character etched into American television history. On the surface, it looked like the kind of success most actors only dream about. Awards, recognition, cultural impact, a household name before adulthood even began. But behind the scenes, something else was unfolding. Something far less glamorous. Because the higher she rose, the less control she actually had. And the story of what happened next isn't just about fame. It's about what fame does when it stops being a dream and starts becoming a cage. In the early 1980s, Justine Bateman became one of the most recognizable young faces in America through her role on Family Ties. The show wasn't just popular, it was a national obsession. Tens of millions tuned in every week, making it one of the defining sitcoms of its era. Her character, Mallory Keaton, became a cultural reference point. Fashion, attitude, even personality quirks from the show seeped into everyday American life. For a teenager, it was an unimaginable level of exposure. But there's something people forget about child and teenage fame. The audience sees a character, the industry sees a product, and the person inside is still trying to figure out where they end and the performance begins. Justine wasn't just acting in a hit show. She was being shaped by it. And by the time she realized what that meant, it was already too late to step back. Because success that big doesn't come with an exit door. Only contracts. At home, things were even more complicated. Her family wasn't just supportive from the sidelines. They were directly involved in the machinery of her career. And as success grew, so did the stakes. What began as encouragement slowly turned into something more entangled, more financially dependent, more structured around opportunity than childhood. There was a moment, one that would later be described in unsettling detail, when the line between parenting and management started to blur completely. At an age when most teenagers are negotiating curfews, she was navigating professional obligations that shaped not just her schedule, but her entire adolescence. And as money entered the equation, the structure of family itself began to shift. Decisions weren't just emotional anymore. They were strategic. Every role, every appearance, every opportunity became part of something larger than childhood, something that looked more like a business than a family. And that dynamic would leave a lasting imprint long after the camera stopped rolling. By the time Family Ties reached its peak, the scale of fame was almost impossible to comprehend by today's standards. There were no streaming platforms, no fragmented attention, just a few networks commanding enormous shared audiences. When a show became popular, it didn't just trend, it dominated culture. And Family Ties didn't just dominate, it defined an era. At its height, tens of millions of people were watching every week. That level of visibility meant there was no separation between public and private identity. If you were on television, you were in people's homes, in their routines, in their conversations. Recognition wasn't occasional, it was constant. And for a teenager still forming her identity, that level of exposure creates something strange. You stop learning who you are privately, because nothing about your life stays private long enough to grow in silence. You become what the world sees, and the world sees a character, not a person. Critically, the success brought validation. Award nominations followed. Industry recognition arrived early. Praise from peers and audiences reinforced the idea that everything was working exactly as it should. From the outside, it looked like momentum. But internally, pressure rarely announces itself while it's building. It accumulates quietly, in expectations, in scrutiny, in the subtle but constant awareness that your face, your body, your performance is being evaluated at scale. And when that happens during adolescence, the effects don't wait for adulthood to appear. They begin immediately. Over time, The pressure around appearance became more than just industry noise. It became internalized. What began as ordinary awareness of being on camera slowly transformed into something more consuming, something obsessive, something that didn't switch off when filming ended. And while the public saw a confident young star, privately she was developing struggles that would last far longer than the role that made her famous. Eating disorders began to take root. At first, like many such struggles, it wasn't visible. It rarely is. It exists in routines, in private decisions, in moments no one else witnesses. But over time, it became cyclical. Restriction, control, loss of control, shame, repetition. A loop that many people outside the experience misunderstand as behavior, when in reality it becomes a system of survival. And the most difficult part is that from the outside, nothing seems wrong. That invisibility makes it even more dangerous, because the world continues applauding while something inside quietly collapses. Meanwhile, the production machine kept moving. Schedules didn't slow down. Scripts didn't pause. Expectations didn't adjust for internal struggle. She was still needed on set, still expected to perform, still part of a system that depended on consistency regardless of what was happening underneath. And that creates a unique kind of psychological split. On one side, public success. On the other, private deterioration. And the longer that gap exists, the harder it becomes to bridge it. Because eventually the performance stops being something you do. It becomes something you are required to be, even when you're alone. At one point, she wanted something many teenagers take for granted: education. A normal milestone. A chance to step into a different phase of life. College. Growth. Independence. But even that simple desire collided with something much larger. Contracts. Obligations. Ownership of time. The reality of being under long-term professional agreements meant that even personal development had boundaries drawn around it by industry expectations. And so, what should have been a straightforward transition into adulthood became another negotiation, another limitation, another reminder that freedom was conditional. Eventually, the cracks in the system became impossible to ignore. The show would end, as all shows do. But endings don't always bring relief. Sometimes they reveal how dependent the structure has become. When the role that defined her disappeared, there wasn't a smooth transition waiting behind it. There was silence, and then uncertainty, and then something even harder: comparison. Because Hollywood moves quickly, new faces arrive, attention shifts, yesterday's star becomes today's reference point. And suddenly, the identity that once felt solid begins to feel like something fading. Not dramatically, just gradually enough that only you notice it happening. There was a moment in her post-fame years that became symbolic of a deeper internal shift, a public performance that didn't land the way people expected, a reminder that playing one iconic character does not automatically translate into limitless versatility. The industry is rarely sentimental about history. It responds to immediate perception. And when perception shifts, opportunity follows, or disappears. In her case, things began to thin out. Roles became smaller, fewer, less aligned with the scale of earlier success. And the message from the industry was subtle but clear. Reinvention would require conformity. Not just talent, not just experience, but transformation. That transformation, as it was presented to her, came with an unspoken condition. Change your image. Adjust your appearance. Adapt to what the industry expects aging women to look like. The pressure wasn't abstract. It was direct. Meetings with professionals. Suggestions framed as advice. Advice framed as necessity. And beneath all of it was a message that has echoed through Hollywood for decades. Relevance is conditional on appearance. But for her, something inside resisted. Not loudly, not publicly at first, but firmly enough to say no, even when that no came at a cost. And the cost was real. Opportunities slowed dramatically. The momentum that once felt unstoppable became scattered. At a certain point, many would have interpreted this as failure. But from her perspective, it was something else entirely. It was separation, a breaking away from a system that had defined her since adolescence. And once that separation happened, she did something unexpected. She stepped away, not temporarily, not strategically, but completely. She didn't disappear in sadness. She redirected. Fashion became one of those outlets, a business rooted in creativity, but free from the pressures of performance-based identity. It wasn't about being seen. It was about building something tangible without constant evaluation. And for a time, that shift offered something rare. Quiet, not the silence of absence, but the silence of control. A life where output didn't immediately become public judgment, where creativity didn't come with instant comparison. But even that chapter, while meaningful, wasn't the final answer. Because identity doesn't resolve itself just by changing industries. It evolves. Later came another shift, one that surprised many people who still associated her with her earlier fame. She went back to school, not as a symbolic gesture, not for publicity, but as a deliberate attempt to understand a world she had been discussing for years without formal tools. Technology, digital systems, storytelling infrastructure. At an age when many people are settling into established identities, she was starting over academically, and it wasn't easy. Nothing about it was easy. Learning complex systems later in life carries a different kind of pressure. There is no former child star advantage in a classroom. Only effort, repetition, failure, persistence, and there were moments of doubt. Moments where the gap between expectation and reality felt overwhelming. But she stayed. And slowly, something shifted again. Not fame, not visibility, but capability. Years later, when she finally completed her studies, it represented something far more important than a degree. It represented proof that identity is not fixed, that reinvention is not theoretical. It is possible, but not comfortable, and rarely linear. But even after rebuilding, she didn't retreat into silence. Instead, she began examining the system she had come from. Fame, she realized, wasn't just a personal experience. It was a psychological structure, a cycle with predictable stages: adoration, intensity, normalization, decline, disappearance, and each stage carried its own emotional consequences. What makes fame unique is not just visibility. It's the loss of reference points. When everyone knows you, you stop knowing how to measure yourself normally, and when that system breaks, it doesn't end cleanly. It lingers. She began writing about it, not as autobiography alone, but as analysis, attempting to understand how identity forms under constant external attention, and how it unravels when that attention fades. The response was strong, because she wasn't describing fame from the outside. She was dissecting it from within. Then came another shift in culture entirely. Artificial intelligence. The entertainment industry began changing faster than it had in decades. Suddenly, questions about performance, likeness, and ownership of identity weren't theoretical anymore. They were urgent, and she became one of the voices raising concern early, because she understood something most people were only beginning to realize. When identity becomes data, control over it becomes negotiable. And for performers, that changes everything. Not just contracts, but existence within the industry itself. She spoke about the implications clearly, sometimes controversially, because change rarely arrives without resistance. The central fear was simple. If human performance could be replicated, then human presence becomes less valuable unless protected. And protection in industries built on speed and efficiency is rarely prioritized unless demanded. So she demanded it, loudly, publicly, even when it created backlash. Because for her, this wasn't just policy. It was continuity of something she had already lived through once before, losing control over your own image. And while these debates continued, her personal and professional identity continued to evolve. Activism, writing, speaking, building frameworks for understanding fame and technology. Each phase connected to the previous one, even when they looked different on the surface, because the thread running through everything remained the same. What does it mean to own yourself in a system that constantly repurposes you? Over time, public perception shifted too, not into nostalgia for the past, but into recognition of a different kind of career entirely. Not one defined by constant visibility, but by transformation. From child star, to working actor, to outsider, to author, to critic of the system that created her. And none of those roles fully cancel the others. They accumulate,